The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Monday Market Matters webinar on a Thursday. Thanks for joining us on our rescheduled plan here. We had a busy front half of the week, and last week was Labor Day, so we chose Thursday. Thanks for joining us. We are going to talk today. We're going to talk about revising and sort of just looking at your rules and regulations from a new angle, and kind of taking what we've what we've learned from this year about our rules and seeing if we can come up with some solutions to test for next season. But before we get started, this will be uploaded to YouTube. So for those of you watching on YouTube, this is a project of Community Farm Alliance. My name is James Cochran. I run the Farmers Market Support Program for Community Farm Alliance. You can learn more about us at cfaky.org. And this is our webpage here to take a look. So it tells you a little bit more about what we do and why we do it. The Farmers Market Support Program is a project that was born out of the Farmers Market Promotion Program of the USDA grant from the Farm Bill. And it's for those of you that are interested in knowing more about the Farm Bill, we're doing some policy work around that as well. Let's see here. And you should take a look at our website to learn more. Now, on to our topic for today. Actually, before we get started, the control panel, for those of you that are on the webinar now, the control panel on the right-hand side has all the tools that you have at your disposal. If you'd like to ask a question over a microphone, you can raise your hand. You should have that option in the right-hand side of your control panel. And if you would like to type out a question, you have an option to type out a question within the control panel as well. So take a moment to explore what you have, the tools that you have in the control panel, and please don't hesitate to utilize them to make sure that you're getting any clarifications that are needed, or if you'd like me to kind of delve deeper in a lot of this. So what we're going to go over today are some of the basics, and then a couple of common issues that I've run into as a market manager myself, and things that I've seen here with CFA as well. So now, the rules and regs is sort of the backbone of your market, right? And there are a lot of difficult scenarios that kind of can come from having rules that are just vague, and you can have people who are there's a personality type that really likes finding loopholes, and sometimes those folks are people that we have to work with at markets. So that I suspect for a lot of you that have experienced some challenges this year with your rules, there at least some of you, it's because of that personality type that you're having some issues. But we're going to go over some very basic stuff. So basically, your rules and regs should match what your mission statement is about. So if you have a mission statement for your market, it should, and that mission statement is about local food, then there needs to be pretty clear rules in your within your packet that sort of explain what local is and what local means to your market, and probably should have some stuff in there about when or if you do allow resale, why and when it's allowable and when it stops. Um, they should be clear, concise, and transparent. Um, Ideally, everybody should be able to understand the rules, and they should be there shouldn't be any vagaries or confusion after you read them. Um, so if you had any issues with that, that's a good thing to kind of revisit this year as well. Um, they should be pro-competition. I know there are a lot of markets that have one grower that is sort of the one person who sells, say, corn at your market. Um, and that can be both a boom and bust thing, and it's a very challenging thing to navigate. But it's important. That person could eventually decide to go to a bigger market nearby, or just retire, and then you don't have corn, and one of the bigger draws for your market is gone. So one of the reasons for having like a sort of a pro competition approach to your rules is to make sure that you are um, that you are you have an eye towards the future, because anything can happen with anyone, and it's good to have some redundancies, um, if possible, with your vendors, so that you don't ever have to worry about losing customers over missing product. Those rules should also be enforceable, um, and I really think that if there's a way to navigate developing sort of a mediation process for people to kind of appeal a decision, I think that's a really important thing. And it also, if you can get the language right, it can circumvent expensive lawsuits as well, because you're resolving everything without involving lawyers, which is where the prices get pretty high. There should also be consequences for rule violations, specifically for vendors. I know we've all worked with markets that or vendors that are hard to work with. So sometimes the only way to get folks to follow the rules is by showing them that you mean business, and the only way to do that is to um, provide some consequences for not following them. Um, you should really look into making sure there's language in your rules about discrimination, and making sure that you are not being discriminatory towards any community. That could be either racial or what's the word, spiritual, or um, political even. So just you want to be as neutral as possible, because everybody eats, and everybody should love coming to the farmers market. You want to make sure that that's a welcoming experience. Um, and then the last thing with rules and regs that you want to think about is how you can reduce your own liability as a market leader, or as the market in the market as a whole. So, say you can have rules, and you can have rules in your rules in your market that sort of require safety standards for tripping hazards, and within the booth, for example, that will make sure that that lovely elderly lady who was just engaged in a conversation, turning around, doesn't trip on something and fall and hurt herself um, in a booth, which opens you up to a hefty lawsuit. So those are the main big things that you want to have in your rules, general concepts. So a couple of resources that are included in this PowerPoint, which is also included as a handout within your control panel. You should see a section within the control panel that says handouts. There are two things in there. One of them is this PowerPoint presentation, which has the links included that I'm about to show you. And then there's also a PDF from the USDA's very own farmers market in Washington, D.C., which of course is a um, bureaucratic gold standard of how to write your market rules. They're pretty airtight. I like them a lot, and they're a good place to kind of get ideas from. I know bureaucracy is sort of a curse word for a lot of folks, and in some cases this is sort of that. But um, the language exists to make sure that you don't expose yourself to problems, and it's a lot easier to kind of get ahead of it than it is to um, react. So the two other resources that are available, we have the Farmers Market Coalition Rules and Regs FAQ, which is a great bit of, there we go, Farmers Market Coalition FAQ, and it goes through a lot of great suggestions, some of the things that we'll go over today as well, but it's sort of a repackaging of what we'll talk about. But there's lots of great stuff in here. Especially one that I think is a great thing for everyone to think about is transitioning from one type of fee system to another. I know the thing that I see most frequently within markets is a real revenue issue. And part of that is that the stall fees are just a little too low to match the capacity needs of a market manager and just making sure that the market is competing with the options in that community. The other one is the BC Association Farmers Market, Association of Farmers Markets. It's in British Columbia, and it's sample market documents. You see there are rules for one, two, three, about maybe 15 or so farmers markets, and then a bunch of applications as well. So it's a nice little resource to get some ideas of ways that you can structure your market so that it is nice and tidy and won't be able to then can withstand some troublemaking. Okay, so super quick, I just wanted to introduce one idea that I've come across that I really like, is this idea of developing a bill of rights for the farmers market. So that would be sort of the customers and farmers bill of rights. So a couple of I threw out a couple of suggestions. None of these things are required to be on one, but I think that's a good way to think about what you can do for your market, and so that you can kind of show your customers, what it is that they can expect for their experience. So I have, I came from an association that had explicit language within the rules that said you are allowed to negotiate prices. So it's what I know. You don't have to have this, but you can have something in there about customers have a right to, challenge or ask for a lower price for items, or there are other options like customers have a right to safe. I mean, I think the most important things to me on this list are safely handled food and knowing the prices of items without having to ask. The abundant selection of product is especially difficult for some of the more rural markets because you're kind of beholden to who you have available to come to the market. But it is it kind of speaks to the goal that you want to it speaks to what you would like the market to become. So you can kind of have it in there as a sort of a guiding principle, and then ideally you'll have other rights for your farmers markets, your farmers themselves, so that they feel comfortable knowing that the rules are designed to actually help the market and them. to make sure that everyone succeeds. So you want to make sure that and this one here, the the sell what you grow. Uh, if there are markets, if you may have a market where resale is allowed, and you want to kind of work out the details of when resale is allowed versus when local product is takes priority, and the resale stuff needs to um, be removed from the market. So it's a neat idea. It's a good thing to tease out. If any of you would like to kind of workshop that, I'm more than happy to do so with you. And our staff here at CFA, I think they'd all be happy to work with you on it as well. So feel free to reach out to me or Margie or Kristen or Nathan if you'd like to kind of workshop this idea at all. Okay, so another quick primer. Just wanted to kind of really quickly explain the difference between rules and regs and bylaws for those of you that may not be clear about it. Rules and regulations have to do with the external governance of the marketplace. Bylaws have to do a lot with the internal governance of the organization. So how the board meetings are run, how the leadership meetings are run, who's in charge, how the votes work, what it takes to pass a rule, how many of the board members need to be present, that sort of thing. And that's where the bylaws land. And so some of the stuff we're going to touch on could probably land in bylaws, especially when it comes to mediation. But they especially need to be alluded to within the rules and regulations as well. So rules and regs, of course, detail a lot more with market operations and then sort of agreed upon behavior for the market vendors or farmers. And you can also allude to sort of the rights, this Bill of Rights concept as well within that for anyone to see. So the first thing I want to actually before we get too deep, I have one poll I want to run to you guys. So I threw out a poll. I'm curious to know how everyone who's on this webinar feels about your rules. Okay, the answers are coming in. All right, 70% voted. We'll give it another 10 seconds or so. Wow. Okay, so how do I close this? Close. So here are the results. Let me see, am I showing it on the screen? So 25% across the board, everyone feels, it's neutral. We got a wide mix of people here, so that's good to know. Okay, thanks, Babette, for clarifying. We have a market manager on here who is representing 2 markets. Okay, so let me close this and close the poll. Okay. So the first thing I'd like for everyone to kind of think about, and now's a really great time to do that because things are beginning to calm down within the market. The chaos of the heat and rapidly growing veggies and rapid picking and packing and selling is kind of beginning to slow down. School's back in session. So, a lot of the midweek markets are beginning to slow down. So, what I'd like to do is sort of have you guys think about just sort of really broadly how things went this year. You may have um, one specific incident in mind, that's great. And we can talk about those if and when they come up. But I challenge the folks that are thinking of one thing to think about the whole year, because there's probably a couple of little things that could be looked at for rules. One of the things that I think I found to be most challenging when I managed markets was how to enforce vendor attendance. We have stuff in the rules about it, but we still have you have to kind of find sort of a sweet spot between being empathetic enough to understand how challenging it can be when your car breaks down versus holding people to a higher standard so that the market itself doesn't underperform from the customer's eyes. So it's a fine line, but we want to talk about we want to think about that. We want to think about revenues. How do things look this year? Are you in the black? Are you in the red? And do we need to think about stall fees or other ways to fundraise? And then I included these are just a couple of ideas. So how did bad weather days perform? And what are your rules on bad weather days? So measure sort of that experience, that reflection against your rules. And so were there any loopholes that were sort of exposed by anyone in the market? Did it violate sort of the spirit of the rule? Were there any issues with somebody kind of doing something that doesn't quite fit with the way you want to have your market perceived, the way you want the market to behave? A really important one is how things looked on a competitive level. It's a really important thing to make sure, like I said before, that the market feels very welcoming to as many people as possible. So, was there any producer that decided that they are the only apple grower that can be allowed to sell in the market, and we're taking steps to make sure that nobody else could sell apples? Did you get any specific complaints from any customers about signage or a hazard or food safety? Those things are really important to pay attention to, because I heard this once and it's really stuck with me ever since. You earn customers one by one and you lose them by the dozen. It's a really important thing to hear what the customers have to say, because they're really important to make sure that we are in touch with what they want. And then, measuring those sort of experiences against whether or not there is a rule that could have prevented any of those incidents from happening, and how would you enforce it? So we're going to go over a couple of scenarios to kind of jog your memories and get things going, and then we can kind of see if we can go through a couple of see if we can kind of workshop a few issues, if you guys are if you're willing to share. So the order of these are not quite the same as what I'm going to be going through. I did some rearranging, but I didn't fix this slide, so apologies ahead of time. But first thing we're going to do, first I wanted to kind of throw out some categories for rules. So for example, vendor display or signage, um, things you want to think about when you are thinking about implementing a rule or changing a rule or tweaking a rule for vendor display is most important thing you want to do is think about the market from the eyes of a customer. What are they? What's their experience like the moment they walk in? Are they going to walk in and see a messy booth with filthy tables and wrinkly bell peppers on it? Are they seeing a booth that has tablecloths and nice signs and well marked product that sort of explains what it is? Um, does the market need to have some sort of aesthetic standard? One of the things it would be good to think about is this world where we have very prominent social media sort of activity, we have to start thinking about how the aesthetic of the market a little bit more, because everyone's taking pictures and they're getting shared. So um, I'm throwing out the idea that maybe there should be some aesthetic standards for your market. I have, in my experience, I've run a market where we've required tablecloths and specific types of tints. Um, and the Easy Up format was the tent, and it was a nice way to hold markets to a specific um, standard for a couple of reasons. The Easy Up tents were a little bit less dangerous than the ones that you could put together with pipes. Um, some of the old guard may know about these older pipe and tarp tents, but those tend to be a little bit more dangerous in windy conditions. Um, but it helps kind of make sure that the market has sort of at least a minimum of a look that is you know not hard to achieve. Um, and other options are sort of this concept of resale. Um, and do you want the resale items to be clearly posted? Um, I think that that's an important thing to have as well. And then, of course, signage for double dollars, WIC, senior vouchers, and SNAP are really nice. And you want to have rules for that as well. Some of those rules are actually in sort of required within WIC and senior vouchers, for example, that you have to post that if you're accepting the vouchers. But it doesn't hurt to repeat those within the rules. Um, so just sort of a couple of ideas, just sort of some suggestions about with rules is price signs, making price signs mandatory, requiring tablecloths, and clearly marking resale items. All right, I have a question here. Yes, Suzanne, the PowerPoint is in the handouts. If you look in your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, you should be able to download the PowerPoint, as well as a PDF of the USDA's Farmers Market in Washington, D.C. at their headquarters, the rules and regs that they have there. Okay, another sort of scenario is product mix. So your market, you want to be able to kind of have some flexibility with the product mix, so you don't have one. In my opinion, you don't want to have too little of anything if you can avoid it. And it's not necessarily easy to do, especially with people who come to the market in early May and are wondering where eggplant is. But there's a fine line between product mix and education, right? And I invite you all to kind of come up with how you want to manage that. But temporary vendors are things that you need to think about is if you want to include temporary vendors of some sort or substitute vendors, um, or if you want to have some sort of language about resale items when the, when things like if say people, people want tomatoes badly, but your rules are very clear about, being within your county, within the market. The vendors need to be within your county or a county that touches the borders of your county. Um, so you could have an option for a resale um, from somewhere a little bit further south, maybe, where they got their stuff a little bit early, so you can get a sort of a kickstart for tomatoes, for example, before sort of the local stuff is ready to go. Um, so there's ways to kind of implement that into your rules, um, or if there is, say you had a lot of flooding at a couple of your important growers this year, maybe you want to have something in your rules about substitute vendors that kind of make sure that it's clear that that substitute vendor is there to be a substitute underlined. So the folks that are recovering from the flood damage will be welcomed back with open arms when they get things back up and running the next season. Um, so, um, but you also want to kind of see if there's language you want to include about managing product mix so that there's not too much of a single type of um, vegetable or fruit or item. So, I mean, I've been to a couple of markets where I've gotten a lot of complaints from vendors about um, there being too many people selling tomatoes, and because of that, nobody's making any money. And that's an issue that's not an easy one to solve. But one of the things you can implement within your rules and regs is sort of a potential sort of screening for um, product mix to make sure that you aren't bottoming out the prices of your um, fruits and veggies during market hours. That's a really important thing to kind of include too. Um, so that's just a couple of ideas, a couple of rules to consider there. Um, let's see, got there. Oh, what was the other thing I had? I lost it. We'll come back to it. Okay, so with resale, a number of markets that are within our program and around the state, they have, for a number of reasons, they have markets. Their market allows resale um, for for purchase, resale of apples, for example. Some of the things that would be really good to think about are um, why you want to have resale in your market. The number one reason would be to make sure that customers are getting your customer experience is good because they're getting everything that they want. They want from a farmer's market at your farmer's market. However, it creates challenges because the moment that person becomes the reselling product becomes a permanent or semi-permanent member of your market, it creates a challenge if somebody comes in at a later date. If we're going to keep using apples as an example, who just set up an apple orchard and are now, they'd like to sell the apples and they want to come sell at your market. What do you do about the fact that there's resale apples and an actual farmer who wants to sell their apples at your market? So it's a good thing to kind of stay ahead of. Um, Resale also creates a little bit of customer confusion um, because people don't read signs as nearly as much as we'd like them to, including myself. I wish I read signs more than I do. Um, but there, more often than not, there are customers uh, who will think that let's say a farmer that's reselling a neighbor's product will just think that everything on that table is theirs, and the farmer won't necessarily correct them. And that can be an issue. That's an issue of trust that can be hard to recover from if it's ever broken. So um, there's some delicate things to think about. Um, all right. So some of the things that I think would be really good is to make sure that you have a very clear resale section if you're allowing it. Things need to be very clearly and conspicuously marked as resale. Um, and that way you can make sure that you can at least point to signs if there's confusion and make sure that folks are following the rule. Or you can just not allow any resale of any kind. Um, or you can have some sort of seasonal concept for resale. I think this first one is probably, oops, I can't click on these things because it advances the slide. So I think having some allowable resale in your market makes sense, but I think the most important thing is that there needs to be some sort of approval process on an annual basis that uh, makes sure that there aren't new opportunities coming in from folks that won't be reselling. That would be a long-term better addition to the market than a reseller, because it doesn't take long for a market to go from a, a fully local, community-supported market to sort of a what's the word, peddlers sort of situation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not what farmers markets are. So, um, it's a matter of figuring out how you feel about it. All right, I got to speed through these a little bit faster. Sorry, guys. Um, Product integrity. I don't know. I don't know if you guys have ever dealt with this like I have. In California, there are a lot of produce houses all over the state. So it's really, really easy to just pick up a case of broccoli, a case of chard, um, and bring it to the market and sell it for a little bit more than you paid for it on a per bunch basis. Um, so um, there are that is an issue. There are people who um, will sort of cheat the system without anyone really realizing it. I mean, most of the folks on this webinar, you guys have all done some growing, so you know the difference between a graded out carrot and or potato versus one that was really kind of grown in a small operation. But customers don't know that, and then they come to expect these um, perfect, perfectly sort of uniform sized carrots every time they go to the market, and it can be an issue. Um, and I think there's some liability issues there too, with sort of guaranteeing um, guaranteeing that everything's local and not being able to back it up if and when the time comes that somebody figures it out. So it's a little risky, but things you want to make sure that uh, things you want to think about is this customer's right to know what they bought, which was an idea which is something I think would fit really nicely in a Bill of Rights idea. Um, and then there's sort of labels. The other biggest thing that I get worried about with product integrity is folks that maybe reselling stuff as organic when it was not legally grown that way, um, and using signage that claims it's organic without any of the backup. Organic is, regardless of how you feel about sort of what the term organic has become, it is very much a legal term. So um, you can use organic methods and not be certified organic and sell your product, but you cannot label it as organic. You have to do it. It has to be done in a certain way, and that opens you up to issues with the USDA and other problems that can happen. I mean, I've been to markets where you never would have expected somebody from um, somebody like an important person from USDA or let's say the National WIC office coming to your market and being like, where are these things? Why aren't they up? Or what's wrong? This person is clearly violating the rules, and it's a bad look. So it's a good thing to get ahead of. Some things you want to also think about is sort of what the consequence of a customer discovering that they've been sort of, in a light sense, defrauded. Um, but they're going to feel like they've been lied to. So that's not a good feeling to have if you want regular customers. So some things you can think about for product integrity. I know a couple of you already have this. Megan, I see you're in attendance. Thanks for coming. I know that Megan, the Covington market has on-farm inspections, and that we've had conversations about that in the past. But they're a good idea. They're very time consuming, um, especially if you're doing it for the first time. But and maybe Megan can speak to this. But the nice thing is once you get it over with, it's really just sort of doing a check-in on once you kind of you set the base of your inspections. You're just doing check-ins annually that are on a much less frequent level. So you don't have to do every farm every year, but you have to get them all kind of done within a similar time window so that you have a baseline. And then if there's any like weird stuff that pops up on somebody's table, you can check in on them in the future. Another idea that I've kind of been chewing on is something I saw from an organization called, or a certification program called the Certified Naturally Grown program, which is a peer-to-peer inspection requirement. Something you can have the producers agree to is that they would inspect each other. There's a bit of an honor system that would happen with that, but for the most part, I think that honor system would be enough to make sure that people are doing things the way that the market wants. So it may be hard to agree to, but it's just an idea. And then some sort of very clear language within the rules about an automatic written warning or suspension or fine or even just sort of zero tolerance policy. And this is all up to you guys. These are just ideas of what happens when you find, say, stickers on watermelon that say product of California. So just a couple of thoughts there. And this was sort of the bane of my existence for a really long time, is how often you have to deal with the same people coming in 10, 15 minutes before the market starts, not being ready to sell when the market is open because they got there late. Um, and you have customers coming in and asking to buy something, and they're like, "Oh yeah, let me go get it. It's buried in this stack of boxes." It's just not a good look. That means the market's not ready yet. And so for me, I've always wanted to have something in rules wherever I am to sort of speak to the fact that everyone should be getting there no later than 30 minutes before the open hours. Most people take at least half an hour to get set up from drop off, from unloading to fully set up. It takes at least half an hour. Most people take longer because they want their booths to look nice. So um, having some kind of language in the rules that sort of set that expectation, um, or set the expectation of what people do with their vehicles. So if you are a market where you're in a street closure, for example, or in a parking lot, there's a clear expectation that no vehicles are going to go through the shopping lane during market hours or 30 minutes beforehand. Um, so it guarantees that there's never ever going to be even the slightest chance of somebody's foot getting rolled over while somebody's creeping through and they're dually flatbed, right? So it's 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 good for a number of reasons, aesthetics and also safety. And then another thing that I've seen a lot is sort of this: what do you do with farmers that or vendors, for that matter, that are being bad at communicating if they're coming or not? You can have language in the rules about cancellations per season or a number of no-shows, um, or you know, at what point is it a no-show versus a cancellation? Um, we used to have, and I never really liked this, but my last association used to have a 48-hour window, um, or 48-hour notice requirement. So if you couldn't make it, you have to tell us within 48 hours. That felt a little um, too far out for me because most of the things that keep people from trying to make money at a market are not planned. So um, I was a lot more forgiving about that window than some of my other colleagues were, but I felt I feel like the most important thing to do is make sure that they are communicating whether or not they're coming. So especially if you have um, a or like a spotty market where you got a lot of booths that are spread out and you have a bunch of gaps in them, it just looks weird. Um, and I like to tighten up my markets so that the booths are a lot more close together. Um, but that can also sort of depend on your um, sort of what the space you have. Sometimes you need to fill it out. Let's see. Let's see. Megan asks, we have a problem with absenteeism, but we don't want to be overly punitive. Any suggestion on minimum number of cancellations for a 52-week season? Well, I wish I could give you a clear answer, but like many things, the answer is it depends. Depending on how frequently it happens, you may want to push markets to be just a little, or vendors to be just a little bit more attendant or communicative. So if you have a vendor who let's say their season is 25 weeks out of the year and they no show 5 times, um, maybe, and they're like the big problem, but there are other folks too. Maybe you want to do a minimum of 3 weeks no shows. no-shows per year. But it really just sort of depends on how frequently they are in season and how communicative they are, and how you feel about that. Because the idea behind the 48-hour rule that my coworkers used, or that my last association used, was that it gave the managers a day at least to find a substitute. That's not necessarily going to be the easy. That's not necessarily going to be the solution um, for markets here, if you don't have sort of a Rolodex of growers to reach out to. So, you know, if they give you enough time to kind of make sure that the market layout looks right, maybe that's good enough. So, um, you know, Megan, I'd be happy to kind of chew on that with you at a later, you know, offline sometime. So if anyone else has any other questions, don't hesitate to use that question section in the box in the control panel. All right, I'm at slide 14 of 22, and we have nine more minutes, so I got to blow through these. One of the things that you need to kind of make sure that you are writing into the rules is sort of a clear sort of expectation if you have a market manager, because that ultimately the easiest way to make sure that rules are being enforced is having somebody whose job it is to enforce the rules, among a couple of other things. And so they need to have the independence to enforce the rules, especially with board members if the board members are violating them. It can make things a little tense at board meetings, but the board members need to be the gold standard for how the market and its vendors behave. So the most important thing is that everything is transparent and consistent. So if a rule is violated, I think the best thing to do is to, especially if you have some sort of written warning system to go with it, the best thing to do is to have copies of the rules and give them to somebody, highlight the rule, and explain why that rule exists, and give that to them. And then you can, if you want to do a written warning with it, you can include that. So then we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But you need to make sure that you're very clear about, and this is something that I wasn't very good about, was sort of making very absolutely clear that this was step one of 5 steps that could get you removed from the market. So I would just be like, I don't like what you're like. This is not right. You need to fix it. But I wouldn't say this is your verbal warning. So I'd have to say it I wound up doing the verbal warning a couple of times before I got to the point where I did a written warning. And it would have been far faster and more efficient to just shut it down, go straight to the written warning on the second infraction, and just escalate it to the point where it's over. Because that's all you want. You want a fast conclusion, right? Some consequences for being late or no-show. So we'll get to consequences here in a minute. The thing that I like the most for consequences is sort of a multi-step, clearly laid out process. So there's a verbal warning, a written warning, possibly a second written warning, depending on how you feel about it, a suspension, and then termination. So, and you'll need to have language within, you'll have to kind of spell it out how you feel, what do you feel comfortable with? Sometimes people feel weird about giving people too much length, and some people feel weird about being too harsh too fast. So it's a matter of feeling comfortable with it and making sure that the whole market and the board leadership feels comfortable with how you want to structure it. So other things let me blow through this. I'm sorry, I'm being a little long-winded today. So concerns to weigh for revenues. Let me get into the revenue structure, Woody, and then we'll get to the disciplinary stuff in a few slides. Um, Concerns to weigh for revenue structure are especially, you want to have language in your rules about refunds. If somebody comes to the market, they tank, and they're out in 2 weeks. What do you do if you guys have an annual payment structure? What do you do in that? What do you do for that person? Do you want to refund or prorate some of the membership fees, or do you want to just have it say it's a one-time cost? That needs to be clearly explained in your rules. Given what I've seen with the financial structures of the markets that are in the state, sort of on an average, from looking at on an average standpoint, I think most markets need to have no refund policy because the revenue needs to be boosted a little bit. There should be some clear benefits if you have sort of different types of members. I know a lot of markets have like sort of an application for full members, and then they have, to appease sort of the concern of people who want to just test the water, they have sort of a $5 a week until you pay for the full membership kind of structure. So you want to have some clear benefits to just being a full member up front versus gradual buy-in, or what happens when you finally complete the full buy-in as sort of in stages. So having some language there is important, and then making sure you're thinking about your business plan goals as you're writing your revenue structure to make sure that they match the goals, because you don't want to just make a business plan and then ignore it. That's the way business plans fail. So a couple of things you want to think about there. Okay, so now here we are, disciplinary actions. Cool. So the most common thing, Woody, that I see in everyone else is this sort of three-step solution here. So, ooh, that was terrible. I'm not very good at that, it turns out. Okay. Very carefully. Okay. So verbal warning, written warning, suspension, and then permanent removal or termination. So the suspension, you could include a third word, like a suspension for a month, suspension for a quarter, and then or suspension for a year. There are lots of ways to sort of cut it. The easiest thing I think the most important thing to do is to sort of have like a good sort of a good understanding of sort of the product inventory that you have in your market, and what would happen if the most important vendor in your market, we all have them, were to be suspended for an extended period of time. So, because it can have a really bad impact on the customer experience, which again is a very important thing to think about. So, yeah, that's the one that I usually find myself landing on. I welcome other ideas, but you should make sure that the violations are very clearly understood, that the people know exactly, especially if you're in the moment where that's it, I've got to do something about this. You have to make sure you're very clear about why you are taking steps towards ultimately permanent removal. And you're not necessarily going to do that, but you have to start the process. If you don't start the process, you become a doormat. And if you're a doormat, then the market is not really being run anymore. And sometimes that works out okay, but eventually it's going to get to the point where the market will most likely split. because there are going to be people who want things done a certain way and people who want things done a different way, and that a split market is not necessarily a great solution. And I think there are a number of you that have um, experienced what happens when a market customer base is split in half, and it's not good for business. So it's a good thing to kind of get ahead of it, be professional about it, uh, do your very best to not be personal and not get personal about it, but very clear like rules and regs. For example, Woody, I know that you are very much I think ex Navy, if I'm remembering correctly. So you know about rules and regs and procedures, so you're in good shape there. All right. Um, Lori, suggestion for encouraging attendance as opposed to punishing absence. Vendors with the best attendance get first choice of booth space or other benefit. That is a good. That is a very good way to kind of shape the attendance rate. Um, and I think is that Margie. I think if you're listening, is that what Bria did? I feel like that's what they did for the winter market. Um, and I can let me unmute you. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. You know what? Laurie White's on this call, and she's currently with the Berea Farmers Market, so
Oh,
I'll
okay.
let her answer.
Okay, that was her suggestion. The question was from her, so that works out. Sorry, Lori, I didn't recognize your voice. I didn't recognize your name. Okay, so cool. Yeah, that's a far more positive way of handling it. I'm used to. I think I tend to skew towards um, trying to rule with an iron fist because I tend to not be an iron fist person in person, but I like the rules to be airtight so that I can kind of navigate them and be the forgiving person. Whether that works or not is sort of up to you. Okay, so one of the things that I think most markets should have uh, is sort of a solution for mediation. Um, so there should be, I think it'd be a good idea to think about. You don't necessarily need it immediately, but um, it's important to think about what happens if somebody has a problem with the way things went down. So, say for example, you've issued the written warning, you've issued the verbal warning, you've issued the written warning, maybe you've issued it twice, then they've been suspended and they don't like it. Um, Having some sort of mediation for them to sort of appeal the decision um, is a good idea. It's time consuming. It's probably hard to get. Um, there's going to be challenges with getting people that have enough time to do that, especially if you keep it within your organization, because you have volunteer farmers who are the president, and that alone is enough to keep somebody super busy with their work and then this little side gig that they probably didn't know what they were getting themselves into. So, um, but I think that having having the process there can almost um, is almost like a preemptive way of keeping the issues to a minimum because people will have an opportunity to contest. But if you're doing things right, especially with this sort of written warning system, you have a paper trail of um, what it how we got here, and then that will be looked at in this mediation process. So, but without it, you're kind of opening yourself up to lawsuits about, um, you know, what's the word? Sort of negatively impacting other people's business. Um, and they're both the same thing, but one way involves lawyers in the court and or maybe even small claims court if you're lucky, but it's still just as time consuming and could be more expensive. So I would encourage everyone to kind of look into that. I don't have a lot of good resources on mediation, but um, I think having sort of a plan for it is a good thing to shoot for, a good thing to work towards in the future. One of the things I see way more frequently than I'd like is food and fire safety violations at markets. I see a whole lot of people handling food with rubber gloves than handling cash with those same rubber gloves, and then handling food again with those same rubber gloves. And that's not how rubber gloves work. You need them to, they protect the dirt. They protect the dirt from getting in the food, and if you're handling dirty things with the dirty gloves, then they are no longer useful. So I see that a lot. Not necessarily every time I go to a market, but I see it enough that it drives me batty. The other thing that I've run into a lot is folks that don't even realize that they should have a fire extinguisher at their booth. And those, I mean, that is for folks that are using flame or cooking at the market. So if you have, say, like a kettle corn booth, they need a specific kind of fire extinguisher versus somebody who is grilling on a gas grill. So, but often, more often than not, they have the wrong. Like what I've seen is they have what they thought was the right size, but it's a little too small, or it's way too small, or it's out of date, or it's not certified. The thing that I haven't seen a lot of is sort of enforcement from the fire departments, especially in some of the more rural parts of the state. But that doesn't mean that you can't get ahead of it and make sure that people are being safe. The last thing you want is someone to set themselves on fire at the market, or a customer for that matter. So having some rules in your having some rules within your regs that sort of talk about the size of booth versus the size of fire extinguisher, and that being mandatory and within X amount of feet of the booth, or some of you guys might have markets that are open on very cold days out of the year, and people bring those propane heaters. They should really have a fire extinguisher too. It's really just sort of the best interest of everyone that there's a fire extinguisher present, and that is another thing that markets themselves could have for use, and sort of keep them and hand them out, but that becomes expensive. The other thing that I really appreciated doing for myself was doing the food handler's license. And I think in some cases you could have rules that require somebody licensed in food handling in the booth at all times. I mean, in some markets you'll get sort of the 16-year-old kid who's making things according to the way that the boss taught them how to do it, but it has no idea about food safety. And sometimes I think that part of me thinks that it would be good to have some sort of rule in those scenarios that sort of mandate that food safety, that there be somebody in the booth that's handling food that knows exactly what's safe and what's not. So just an idea. So the last one of the, let's see, we're getting pretty close here. I got three more slides, so hang in there. One of the things that you want to make sure you have is uh, enough transparency and enough ways for people to um, ask for clarification or appeal a decision that was difficult to sort of swallow. They may, that person, if that person is appealing, they may wind up not being very happy in the end because they're not going to get what they want. But it's really important for sort of the benefit of the market that there's some language included in your rules that sort of allow for folks to try to remedy the problem that they've just kind of created, or that was just created for them, depending on how you look at it. But one of the things that I think is really important is to make sure that there's some sort of, if you have a market manager, there's an opportunity for the vendors to express how they felt the year went with the market manager. And then the board can then have that sort of as a reference point when the market manager is being reviewed. Like there's a review, and ideally there's a review annually by the board for the market manager to talk and sort of discuss what happens next year. So I think that there's one of the most important things is to really do your best to make sure that the market doesn't split off. And one of the things that I've seen a lot, and this year is sort of I've seen it a lot more, is where markets will, I've said it, I've already said it, but they'll split their customer base by moving to a different market, and it creates a problem. Because now the customers either have to go to both markets or choose one. Sometimes they have to get, if they want two items and those two items are in different markets, they either have to choose to get one and not go to the other, or choose to go to one, get back in the car, go to the other, get back in the car, go home. And it's just, it's not ideal. So ideally you want to have something within your rules that kind of make sure that markets are there's enough sort of democratic processes within the rules to allow for people to challenge how they've been, if they feel like they've been slighted. So and the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the issue that one of the biggest things that kind of get in the way of making big rule changes at a market is that it's going to affect somebody's livelihood. So if you have a tomato grower who's been the only tomato grower forever, and you decide that you need to have something in your rules about product mix, and that there need to be more people growing tomatoes, and you set that as sort of a goal for the year, that person's bottom line could be negatively impacted in the short term. And so there are ways to kind of get out ahead of that, is to get out ahead of making these rule changes to the point where you're giving everyone very clear time, like a very clear window where they can speak their piece about a proposed rule change, and then also there's plenty of time for there to be an adjustment for any rules that go into effect. So, and these numbers are nothing. There's nothing more than just sort of placeholders for what I thought sounded fair when I was writing up these hypotheticals. So 120 days from approval vote for like a big rule change. Not necessarily like we now require tablecloths, but for stuff like we're no longer allowing resale at the market. You have 120 days to kind of get over the fact that you can't resell anymore. And ideally, you're doing this in the off season anyway, so it's not a huge problem. But you're giving people a lot of lead time to kind of adjust. And another idea is sort of this we're gonna vote on this issue next month. Come and speak about it before the board votes. And that's a great way to kind of get ahead of and democratizing the rule changes for your market. Make sure that people are participating. And this is the last slide. So let's see here. So you want to think about implementation. I think this is it was sort of redundant from the last slide. But you want to think about, yeah, this is very much redundant. So ideally, again, you want to think about how you're going to implement these new rules and adjust, make sure that people have time to adjust. So, yeah, especially if there's new equipment that's needed, or like this, if you want to make a requirement for a certain kind of shelter. So if markets are only using umbrellas, our vendors are only using umbrellas for their booth, and you want to make sure that everyone has a collapsible tent, then you need to give people enough time to save up for it, or raise funds for it, or deal with the fact that they have to go make that purchase. So that's about it. I thought we could. I know we ran a little long here, but I'm more than happy to stay on for anyone who's willing to. If you have any questions you want to ask, we can kind of workshop some stuff as a group. But if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the questions panel, or raise your hand if you want to speak through your microphone on your computer. I'd love to work with, I'd love to sort of talk about anything that you guys have. So, yeah, any questions? No? Okay. Well, we're going to wait another 30 seconds and then we'll wrap up. All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for coming to taking the time to revisit this with me. As always, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about rules, your market's rules and regs, and if you would like a second pair of eyes to look at them, see if we can. I mean, I've managed markets for nearly 10 years, so I've seen a lot of loopholes. I've seen a lot of people take advantage of them. And I've seen rules and regs where I felt like things were opened up to unnecessary risks. So don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions or just want to chew on an idea. I enjoy those, so I welcome them, and don't hesitate to reach out to your regional technical assistant as well. Kristen, Nathan, and Margie do a really great job for us, and we every week the four of us take an hour of our day, an hour of our week to sort of put our heads together about any issues that we're sort of working on as a group. So, it's not just one of us dealing with it. It's all four of us at some point. So, again, thanks for coming in. Last thing, there won't be a webinar next month. We've done, I think this is our 7th webinar of the year, which is a big leap forward from last year. We're really happy with it, but we're gonna pause. We're gonna hit the pause button for October so we can kind of focus on getting our reporting sorted out and a couple of other sort of personal stuff that's going on within our team. So have a great rest of the week, and stay tuned for the recording that will be up on our YouTube channel as soon as I get around to editing it. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.